so much for joining us today for Science Gallery Bengaluru's exhibition season Psyche. For those of you who are new here, Science Gallery Bengaluru is a new public institution for research-based engagement. Psyche is our 5th exhibition season and the 3rd one, which is completely digital and online. Over the last few weeks, Psyche has been exploring the complexities of the human mind through our exhibition and our public lecture series. And today, as a part of our lecture series, we're very pleased to welcome China Mills to deliver a lecture titled Unliveable Life, State and Corporate Violence in the Making of Suicide. Before I introduce China to you all, I'd like to mention very briefly some of the programs that are coming up next weekend, which is the very last weekend of Psyche. Do join us for a lecture titled Can Machines Come Alive by philosopher of science Ali Husseini on Wednesday, 11th May at 6:30 p.m. India time. And then on Thursday, Can Cameras Capture Mental Illness? A History of Science Perspective by Harry Wu on 12th May at 6:30 p.m. IST. Now to tell you a bit more about today's speaker. China Mills researches mental distress and suicide in context of social injustice. She explores the way diagnoses travel and circulate around the world and what happens when issues such as distress, suicide, or terrorism get framed as global public health challenges. She is a senior lecturer at City University of London and lead researcher on Healing Justice London's Deaths by Welfare project. In 2014, China published the book Decolonizing Global Mental Health, the Psychiatricization of the Majority World, which draws on research with NGOs and user survivor organizations in India and analyzes global mental health policies as forms of colonial discourse. I'd like to mention that this program does deal with sensitive subject matter such as suicides, which may be triggering to some participants. We are putting links in the chat where you can reach out for help or to find resources that could be of support. I'd also like to remind the audience that there will be a Q&A session at the end of the lecture. So please do share your questions in the Q&A box and China will be happy to answer them live at the end of the talk. We are also sharing a feedback form. The link is in the chat. This is where you can share your thoughts with us about today's program, about any previous programs or the exhibition that you've attended, and tell us what we might do better going forward. Now I'd like to hand over to China for today's session.
Thank you so much, Madhu. And don't worry, nobody can ever say the word psychiatrization, so you're not alone. I'm just going to put this up here and hopefully just get it started. 1 second. Okay, I hope that you can see that okay. So I just want to say again, thank you so much to Madhu and to the Psyche team for inviting me to facilitate and lead this session today. What a real honour. And to all of you for making and finding the time to be here. It's really a joy for us to be present together in this present moment. So thank you so much. So I've long lived a life that's informed by what is generally talked about as mental illness, or as what I prefer to call experiences of alternate realities and or of distress. And that's because I grew up alongside family members who saw things and heard things that many other people don't, and who psychiatrists at that time diagnosed as having schizophrenia. And so that for me was an early lesson in the way that systems that claim to be, or perhaps should be caring of people who experience differences, can actually be negligent and violent. So even before dreaming of becoming an academic or a researcher, I worked on a suicide helpline. And I'll never forget what some of the folks told me in those conversations, a stranger over the phone, and I'll never know for sure if those people lived or died. But all of those experiences and more thread together to make me curious about and also passionate about transforming the way that hostile social conditions and quite banal everyday forms of violence create the conditions that make people want to end their lives. So another way of thinking about that or saying that is the way that social conditions invite or incite suicide by making life unlivable. So before we go on the rest of this journey together today, I just want to take a moment and just ground us in this moment and tell you a little bit about what's going to come up or not. I suppose another way of saying this is that this is a content warning. But the whole of my work is trying to figure out how to write meaningful content warnings, right? That can engage with people on these topics that touch us all and can be extremely distressing, but are also super important for us to talk about. And so my understanding is that suicide is both deeply personal and highly political. I think it's both, always, all together, okay? And when we talk about suicide now as a group, let's be mindful that suicide has touched many of our lives in different and multiple ways. So there is no them to this conversation, right? This is us figuring this out in different ways together. Today, I'm going to talk about how brutal systems can make people's lives unlivable and about suicides in response to or linked to those systems. Every aspect of this research is devastating, and it's also really enraging. And I think, you know, that grief and that rage can be really transformative, actually. I think we can use that and harness it creatively, and lots of people do. But it also can kind of sit in our bodies in ways that are really hard to figure out and that can become quite harmful for us. So I want to try and be mindful of that, especially because we're all positioned differently in response to some of the things that I'm talking about. For some people, I'm going to be talking about something that touches their lived experience really closely. And what I say might not be your truth, and I'm not suggesting it is, it's just my perspective from a long time of doing this research, and I understand completely, and I'm actually really keen to explore all those different ways of understanding this and different positionalities. So I'll not talk in this session today about any specific details of people's suicides or any methods of suicide or anything. In fact, I think I'm only going to mention one person's name in response to talking about their suicide, and I don't give any details about it. I'm still learning, and I think we're all still learning how to talk about how brutal some of these structural structures, systems, etc. are without actually reproducing those harms. I don't want to talk about this and create the kind of fear and anxiety that I think makes these systems brutal in the first place. But I will make mistakes, and that is part of my learning. And please feel free to tell me if I do make them, either now or through an email after the session. So please take part in the session in a way that honours how you're feeling and that prioritises your care. If you prefer to leave the session today, or you want to just leave for a bit and then come back, you don't have to give a reason. Nobody will notice, and that's the joy of it being on Zoom and being live streamed. And my final slide on this PowerPoint, which I can share with the Psyche team, has a link to some resources that I hope might be useful if you need them. And I think there's also some resources in the chat. So just to talk a little bit about the language of suicide. So how we talk about suicide really matters, okay? And it's quite common across some parts of the world, especially in English, to say committed suicide, okay? And that has a historical lineage of suicide being criminalized, okay? So like when we say commit a crime. So generally, I would try not to use that language, though I respect if that's the way that some people who have that experience want to talk about it. And I generally will say died by suicide instead, to try to de-link suicide from that kind of criminalized genealogy. I also think it's just worth referring to Ian Marsh, who does absolutely wonderful and extremely important work within what's coming to be known as critical suicide studies, which I'll talk about in a second. And Ian Marsh has a wonderful book about suicide where he traces genealogies and histories of our understandings of suicide and of dominant framings. And he talks about how historically there's been a reduction of the kind of descriptive variety of what we might call self-accomplished deaths, or of killing oneself. And those have all been like flattened and constricted into this one word, suicide. And in doing that, we miss out the nuances and the different meanings that underlie and might be behind different forms of killing oneself. Okay. And so by saying suicide kind of delinks and makes us perhaps less inclined to think about that bigger context, the multiple, messy, complex reasons that might lead to suicidality. And that's something that ties in very much with what we're going to be exploring today. So what are we told about when we're told about suicide? And it's worth me saying that I'm located in the UK. I have done work in various other countries, including in India, but my analysis is, I think, constricted by and constrained by a Eurocentric lens, being based in the global north, being based in the UK, speaking English. All of these things mean that I have positionalities that only allow me to see and understand suicide through certain lens. And so I really welcome hearing about any kind of different framings or different readings of suicide that, yeah, may contrast with or contradict what I'm talking about. So suicide, often in that kind of global north, Eurocentric, English-speaking framing, is often understood within by the public, and by health professionals as being an outcome of mental illness or mental disorder. And I don't like using that terminology. I would prefer to say distress. But I use mental illness in quotes because that is often how it's talked about in the kind of literature I'm referring to here, that often talks about the link between suicide and mental illness, or often depression. So, for example, the incredibly popular interpersonal theory of suicide explicitly says that suicide is the result of mental illness 95 to 100% of the time. And some people like Heidi Rimk and Karen Rock have talked about this as being a form of psychocentrism. The framing of suicide as the outcome of an individual problem, as if it can be then treated through psychological, pharmaceutical, or behavioural modification. And we see this is a really kind of dominant approach. So it's quite dominant, for example, in a lot of the work of the World Health Organization. For example, in their 2002 World Report on Violence and Health, recommends that suicide prevention strategies focus on the identification and treatment of people with mental disorders. And we're going to talk more about these kinds of framings all the way through in this session. But I think it's just worth me pausing here to say that I think there's a real temptation here when we kind of think, wait there, is it helpful to always see suicide as being linked to or in a response to mental health? What does that way of understanding or that framing allow us to see and do? And what does it stop us from seeing and being able to do? Okay, so that's what I mean when I talk about framing or a frame. And sometimes I've felt like I'm being positioned into this kind of tight spot binary where I want to de-link suicide from mental distress and say, no, suicide is not always the result of mental health, and that's not a useful framing. And I think that's sometimes true. But the problem with doing that is we leave mental health and mental illness a little bit interrogated if we do that. And I think that's problematic. And I've done it before too, and I'm trying not to do it, because I think it's helpful for us to think that actually the very social conditions, forms of injustice, oppression that may lead to suicide may also be, and we know they are, causal and contributory factors to what we currently understand as mental illness or mental distress. So mental distress can be exacerbated, but it can also be caused by those bigger structural systemic factors, economic, political, social conditions and decisions, right? And so by saying that, it makes it possible to talk about mental distress politically and to draw attention to the way that environments and systems can actually be designed or have underlying logics that incite or lead to suicide. Okay. So as well as this more psychological, psychocentric research, there's quite a lot of research, and I think it's a growing area, that documents social patterns or social determinants of mental health and suicide, taking perhaps more of a public health approach. And even this research, which I think is super important and exciting, but even a lot of this research tends to be about counting and quantifying stresses and identifying individual risk factors. Even though it allows us perhaps to see patterns, it doesn't always allow us to explore suicide and mental health as features of political, ethical, and legal responsibility. And less attention is paid then to factors that are further upstream. So that, what I mean by upstream, is some of the root causes of problems. Okay, so we know that mental health, for example, and suicide may be linked to poverty, but upstream means, but what's causing poverty? Okay, we know that suicide and mental health might be linked to poor housing, they're linked to incarceration, all of these things. But what is causing and what's leading to those things? What are some of the economic and political decisions that lead to the forms of incarceration that we currently have, or the kinds of poverty that we have globally? So that is what's meant by that, getting to the root causes, the radical in that sense. And what that would mean is interrogating the way that governments and big corporations contribute to and sustain what Mark Button calls suicidal regimes. And that means paying attention to the profitability of the political economy of those regimes. And so this, I guess, is why this isn't often researched and looked at, okay? Because it would mean looking at those big systems and really thinking about the forms of responsibility and accountability that are written into those systems, or that are missing from them. And so slightly differently again from the psychocentric and then the social determinants is an emerging but quite sort of rich form of literature, which is attempting to widen the disciplinary and theoretical scope of research into suicide, and to better understand the relationships between suicide, context, and social justice. And on this slide are lots of different book covers by different people who write within this, I'll call it a tradition, though I'm not sure all of, there are key differences in this work. It's not a core set of people as such, but what this work is doing is contextualizing our understanding of suicide and also politicizing it. And one of the book covers of this, sorry, no, that's coming up in a minute, I'm getting ahead of myself. But what I wanted to say was a lot of this literature is part of the Critical Suicide Studies Network, of which I'm also a member. And there's a link here, which I can share this PowerPoint to the Critical Suicide Studies Network website, which is full of the links to the books that I just showed you on the previous slide, and also links to a whole load of journal articles and various publications by people really quite internationally, actually, doing work that links suicide to social justice and injustice, and also seeking to transform those systems of social injustice. So as well as asking, what contexts and conditions lead to suicide, it's also about designing and envisioning and dreaming and identifying existing conditions that do the opposite of that make life livable, that sustain life. And Suicide and Social Justice, edited by Mark Button and Ian Marsh, both of whom I've already mentioned, is one of the newer books as part of this Critical Suicide Studies Network and this kind of tradition, I suppose. And in the book, they ask, if we reconceptualize suicide as a social justice issue, then what new possibilities for understanding and responding emerge? How might we understand, formulate, and represent the relationship between suicide and social justice? And as part of this, then, I'm always struck by this quote, particularly from a chapter in an edited collection on critical suicidology. And the chapter is by Vicky Reynolds, who's an activist and educator and wonderful being based, I think, in Canada. And Vicky Reynolds, this is the chapters from the chapters called Hate Kills, a social justice response to suicide. And Vicky asks, we need to structure into our analysis of a person's death the context of social injustice in which they lived. And this just always stays with me in my work. And this is something that I try to do in all of the research work that I'm going to talk about shortly now. So years after working on the suicide helpline that I worked on, I was researching for my PhD in India. And as Madhu said, I was doing work with and spending time with various different mental health NGOs, and also especially with organisations run by people with psychosocial disabilities or who identify as users of the system, including the wonderful Bapu Trust in Pune. And around that time in Maharashtra, there were, and still are, and were before that time as well, but there was a lot of publicity, I suppose, in newspapers about the suicides of farmers across India, but Maharashtra as a state was hit particularly hard. And I am very aware that many people that are listening now will know far more about this than me, and I will only talk about this briefly. But I was really struck by this and linked to the work that I was doing, okay, thinking about kind of mental health and the colonial legacy of mental health and of psychiatry in India. And so in 2017 and 18, this is a few years after I was doing my PhD work in India, there was an average of over 10 suicides by farmers daily. And as I'm sure many of you will be aware, a lot of research has found that, such as by Mishra, has found that 87% of farmer suicides in India are actually linked to debt, to indebtedness due to the aggressive promotion of agribusiness, the effect of genetically modified seeds on market prices, and being forced into that market with no protection, and increased vulnerability of farmers to crop failure and to price fluctuation of crops in the world market. There is some recognition in the literature of the political economy within which farmer suicides are embedded. But generally, professional and research focus has centred on individual psychological factors and the socio-behavioural practices of farmers, often failing to acknowledge the role of the wider agrarian crisis and how farmers' precariousness within volatile economic markets contribute to suicide rates. So in India, then, the psychology of farmers has been the site of much government intervention and relief efforts. Some states have, for example, made psychological therapy more available to farmers, and others have sent out teams of psychiatrists to rural areas. Similarly, interventions within what might be called global mental health, while I think importantly acknowledging the harm caused by unrestrained economic reforms, have also put forward interventions such as improving treatment for depression and increasing access to antidepressants. So moving away from, and though this is important, perhaps moving away from whether or not that's right or wrong, I think what's important to think about here is what are the assumptions underlying this? And what is it allowing us to transform and to change in our interventions? And one of the assumptions here seems to be that mental disorder, particularly depression, is a contributor to suicide, and that suicides can be reduced through psychiatric interventions and especially increased access to antidepressants. But these kinds of accounts leave the economic role or the economistic rationale that underlies agricultural and economic reforms uninterrogated. And it promotes potentially psychopharmaceutical or behavioural psychological approaches, which are themselves premised on a similar logic, that they have a big market, they're very profitable, and their financial incentives to market and sell, particularly pharmaceuticals. To add an extra little piece into this jigsaw, World Suicide Day and the World Health Organization's World Suicide Prevention Policies are actually sponsored, or one of the sponsors is Syngenta, who are a Swiss biotechnology and agribusiness company that has a large market in low and middle income countries. And Syngenta has been widely slated for aggressive agribusiness practices in India, including restrictive seed patenting, the very practices that contribute to high rates of farmer suicides. And so I suppose a question that sits with me and that I invite you to also consider is, what do you think about companies who contribute to making life unlivable for some, in this case for farmers? What do you think about them also funding suicide prevention and also getting to shape, potentially, by sponsoring the kinds of suicide prevention that get put into action? And if those are the companies sponsoring those interventions, I suppose we might not be surprised by the fact that a lot of those suicide prevention strategies focus on the individual, or at best kind of very local community or interpersonal relations. They don't tend to look at the bigger corporate and state and government factors which are making people's lives unlivable. So some of these stories and experiences, I'll just put that back for 1 second, of suicide in relation to hostile conditions are really not that new, okay? So there is, for example, ongoing, and I mean, there's much understanding, plenty of literature and plenty of lived experience-led scholarship and experiences around, for example, the high rates of suicide in much of what is now Canada and the US, or much of what is now North America, the suicides of Indigenous, of Native and of First Nation folks. Deaths and suicides that really only make sense if we have a social analysis of settler colonialism and of genocide, of ongoing and historical forms of oppression. Okay, so when we start to kind of look historically and into the present, there are so many examples of very hostile conditions producing the conditions for people's suicides, but then the way that the government and various folks involved in suicide prevention omit that bigger context from their understanding or prevention of suicide. Another really stark example of this is people's suicides at Foxconn, which is, I'm sure you will all know about this, and I just wanted to just briefly mention it, but one of the world's largest contract electronics manufacturers, including they make the iPhone, and their industrial park in Shenzhen in China, as well as other facilities in mainland China, is now infamous because workers started to kill themselves there. Foxconn workers describe it as a labour camp with evidence of illegal overtime, failure to report accidents, inhumane and abusive management styles. And Foxconn responded by requiring that employees sign a waiver stating that Foxconn would not be made liable if any individuals were to kill themselves. Because they received such awful publicity from that, they then retracted that, and instead they installed safety nettings around their main building at the facility to prevent future suicides. I put this here because this is just such a stark example, I think, of the way that a corporation produces an environment which results in people killing themselves, and then denies their accountability in that, doesn't do any kind of interrogation of the actual practices of that company in this instance that make people feel suicidal. So putting up suicide nets becomes suicide prevention rather than anything to do with the conditions of overtime, illegal overtime, inhuman and abusive management style, etc. This is truly putting profit before people, right? There's also other super hostile environments that link to suicide, and another of those that is quite close to my heart and that I've done a little bit of work around is suicide in immigration detention in the UK. So the UK detains more migrants than any European country except Greece, and is the only country in Europe to have indefinite detention. So somebody can be incarcerated in an immigration removal centre in detention, and they literally have no idea when they're going to get out. They could get out next week. They could be there for years. I, for 3 years, used to go and visit with and provide sort of forms of support to folks that were incarcerated in 2 of the immigration removal centres that are next to Heathrow Airport in London. And it was truly harrowing to speak to people about the conditions that they were detained in. And actually, from that experience, people told me how that made them want to kill themselves, and they spoke a lot about other people they knew who had. And plenty of research, for example, by groups such as Women for Refugee Women and Medical Justice, have actually found in their more qualitative work that more than half of the people interviewed had thought about killing themselves, and around 1 in 5 had attempted suicide in immigration detention. So I suppose what I'm trying to say by bringing these really different, and they are different, and there are important contextual differences between these different kinds of hostile conditions and suicides, and I'm not suggesting that there are not, but there are also some links. And framings of suicide always involve cultural and ethical interpretive work, and they're always deeply political. So it seems, though, then, that dominant, often Western Eurocentric framings around complexity and around mental illness are somehow unable to understand suicide that may result from suffering that's exhausting, that's enervating, or to quote Elizabeth Povinelli, who talks about the kinds of lethal conditions crafted by the Australian government and corporations in Australia for Indigenous and First Nations folks in Australia, chronic and cruddy conditions, delayed incremental suffering that's dispersed across time and space, banal and administrative, it's kind of suffering that wears people out. And bearing that suffering, an important way to understand, I think, those forms of suffering and violence is summed up in the work of Rob Nixon, who talks about environmental forms of degradation and violence, and the creative and incredible resistance of poor people who are affected by pollutants, chemical leaks, climate change. And Rob Nixon, I'm going to use Rob Nixon's work here, but actually builds on and comes after such a rich tradition of work which talks about the temporality of violence and its slowness. So yes, when we think of violence, we often think of something quick and spectacular and newsworthy, but there is a whole load of other kind of violence in the background that's much more everyday, that doesn't usually make headlines. It occurs gradually and out of sight. The destruction that it causes is delayed, it's dispersed across time and space. It's attritional, might not even be viewed as violence, and its repercussions play out across a range of temporal scales of delayed effects. So it slowly unfolds, this kind of violence. And what's so important about this is that there's a lag, there's a delay between policies or corporate practices and their violent consequences. And so that delay can be weaponized to disassociate effects from causes. So if you release a whole set of policies which are going to have an extremely violent effect on already marginalized folks, some of their effects will be delayed. They won't be felt until later. And I think this is a really useful way of understanding cause and effect in relation to suicide, because suicide is really complex, and it may be almost impossible a lot of the time to sort of use what Eurocentric kind of understanding of cause and effect. So what we need is this slower understanding of violence. And you know, Indigenous people and scholars from settler colonies have been telling us about this kind of slow violence for years. So have disabled people across the world. You know, so this is building on a rich kind of lived experience and scholarship, and also lived experience that finds its way into fiction and creative forms of resistance, into poetry and artwork that explain to us and talk to us about this kind of slowness of violence. And linked to this then, Lauren Ballant talked about slow death as the physical wearing out of a population and the deterioration of people under contemporary global and national regimes of capitalist subordination and the destruction of bodies by capitalism in spaces of production and in the rest of life. So this raises the question of whether we can separate out the intention to die by suicide from a context that is already making people's lives unlivable, a context that's killing them. And I think what's really important here, and what ties into my research that I'm going to tell you about in the next sort of 5 minutes before we finish, is that this kind of slow violence is managed through what Rob Nixon calls powerful distancing strategies, which exploit and weaponize time. These are forms of distancing, deferral, dissociation that stop us from seeing that stop corporations and the state bearing responsibility for the toxic repercussions of their practices and policies, okay, because of that lag or delay between practices and policies and then people's deaths or the harms that these create for people. And what I wanted to talk about now is just to explain this context of these understandings of what underlie and have led me to be so interested in and committed to understanding a specific example of suicide in relation to hostile conditions, and that's suicides and wider deaths actually that are linked to the UK welfare system and welfare reform. And by welfare reform, I mean a series of cuts and very punitive policies that use conditionality, sanctions, deterrence, and intrusive assessments, which are outsourced to private companies for profit, and which were introduced after the financial crisis. So after sort of around 2008, I suppose, onwards, but had a bit of we saw their effects a bit later on because of that delay. And this was accompanied by a long history of the dehumanisation of people claiming welfare, and especially disabled people, as being undeserving, or the word scroungers is often used in the UK. And the press, in newspapers, media, especially the right-wing press, largely helped set the government's kind of groundwork to be able to introduce these policies. They crafted some of the consent, I suppose, publicly for these policies to make sense. And loads of other people have written about this, right? And they've written about it better than I ever will. And many of these people write from lived experience. So some of these books, such as The War on Disabled People by Ellen Clifford, Second Class Citizens by Steph Benstead, The Violence of Austerity by Vicky Cooper and David White, which is an edited collection. Many of these volumes and this work speaks to what I'm talking about today, and do access them if you can, because they're brilliant pieces in this jigsaw, I suppose, of evidence. So to give you some really brief context, and I could talk to you about this for a lot longer, but I haven't got very long. On average, around 80 people per month. This was in 2015. Really, I should say that the government have been so elusive about data and numbers in this sense. And by data, I'm talking about people's deaths. All of those people are people who had lives, had families, had friends, had their dignity and lived their lives. And we talk about them as numbers, and yet we don't even know the numbers because of real issues with sort of accessing data, for which many disabled people have done the labour of trying to get that information so that we can have a better understanding of the impact of austerity policies in the UK. But on average, around 80 people per month in 2015 were dying after being found fit to work. So after having an assessment to decide if they could continue or would be allowed to have certain benefits, certain welfare payments, and being found actually no, they had to be essentially forced into work or pushed into work. Over the period of 2010 to 2013, this particular assessment process was associated with an additional 590 suicides, or 5% of the total number of suicides. And these different forms of assessment and different kinds of benefit payments have been found to be associated with suicidality, with many people attempting suicide who have to go through this process. And so this led me with a wonderful group of people with lived experience, largely with disabled people, but with people of other lived experience of structural marginalisation, to put together the Deaths by Welfare project, which is co-designed and co-produced with people with lived experience, and is investigating deaths, including suicide, linked to the UK welfare system and the violence of state austerity. And it's with and part of and funded by the organisation Healing Justice. It aims to make visible the slow and bureaucratic violence of the state and to contextualise welfare-related deaths as issues of disability, spatial, racial and economic justice. Integral to this work is honouring, uplifting and learning from disabled people's lived experience and resistance. So we've got a podcast of which there's a link here, and you could listen to our first episode, which came out just last week, and I would really welcome you to listen to that and love to hear your thoughts on it. We're also creating a timeline which charts the slow violence of the welfare system and austerity and how that creates the conditions for people's suicide. This is about creating and uplifting counter histories and using history making to evidence the creative, unrelenting resistance and knowledge production by people who experience the welfare system, and especially disabled people. And it's also about making visible the slow violence of welfare reform. Just to give you the context, the government stance on suicides and deaths linked to welfare reform is that they say they take the death of claimants seriously. They undertake reviews, which has been an incredibly secretive process, but they do not accept the argument of those who seek to politicise people's deaths by linking them inaccurately to welfare policy. Of course, in contrast, many different groups have publicly emphasised the political nature of government policy and of benefits-related deaths or welfare-related deaths. And those groups include coroners, researchers, professionals, bereaved families and loved ones, and disability justice activists. Also, people themselves make that link. Right, so there have been a number of suicide notes which have been made public, and this one is from Stephanie Bottrill, who died in 2013 after being told that her benefits would be reduced. In her suicide note, she says the only people to blame are the government. Disabled people have been absolutely central in making public the link between welfare reform and people's suicides and deaths. So, for example, in 2013, the 10,000 Cuts and Counting event saw Parliament Square in London covered with white flowers, each one representing a disabled person who died after this the work capability assessment, so these assessments that determine whether people are fit to work and whether they will be able to access benefits or not. The artist and activist Dolly Sen has done wonderful work that I've massively encouraged you to look up, including a protest outside of the Department for Work and Pensions, which is the UK government department which deals with benefits, holding up hearts with the names of some of the folks that have been killed by these reforms. And you might already know that the United Nations on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities found evidence of grave and systematic violations of the rights of persons with disabilities by the UK government. What you might not know is that this work and the UN investigation was initiated by disabled people and activists to try to evidence and show evidence of these harms. And so just returning to where we started, and I've put a picture of a snail because of the spiral of the snail shell to remind us that these experiences of harms are not linear, right? Like in nature, there is a spiral to this, and we kind of go around in this cycle. And also to emphasize slowness, okay? Because yes, violence can be slow, but some of our responses also need to be considered and might need to be slow. And so thinking about Vicky Reynolds' quote, which I started with, we've been thinking about the ways how we can structure into our analysis of people's suicide, not just the context, well, the context of social injustice in which they lived, and that context includes violence that's systemic, structural, banal, bureaucratic, institutional, where the state and large corporations are the perpetrators and that create conditions that make life unlivable and incite, elicit and invite suicidality. I'm just going to skip that slide. And I just wanted to say that we're not the only people doing this. For example, Danias Pouras, who was until recently the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health, and who I'm very grateful to have done some work with, says that we need a human rights approach to suicide that goes beyond focus on mental health. And suicide prevention must address the structural factors that make lives unlivable. And this report and many of his reports are really worth accessing if you're interested in this more sort of structural understanding of mental health and suicide. And so just to end by saying that any analysis of suicide, such as framing it as complex or as linked to mental illness, do particular kinds of work depending on who uses them or mobilises them. We need representational and narrative strategies that allow us to see complexity, but also to acknowledge more than a single cause, but that do not mobilise that complexity as a tool to deny culpability. Okay, so don't say, well, it's complex, so we could never link it to government reforms, for example. I personally believe that tweaks and reforms in parts of the system are never enough, though we sometimes need them to make this present moment survivable. They might never be enough because the underlying logic and profitability of these systems create conditions that devalue certain lives and kill people, partly through inciting them to kill themselves. So if environments can be designed to be hostile and to elicit suicidality, then they can also be designed differently for social justice, for livable lives, right? So if we reconceptualize suicide as a social justice issue, then we might ask what new possibilities for understanding and responding emerge, as we started with Ian Marsh. Thank you so much for listening. And I've just put some links here to find out more about Healing Justice London and about our project. And we also have some resources which might be helpful for you if you're needing a bit of grounding or centering after today's session. I'd also very, very much love to hear from you. Really interested in linkages that you can see and in your own experiences. So just thank you so much for listening. And I would love to hear any questions.
Thank you so much, China, for this really eye-opening session. We've asked the audience to, of course, share their questions in the Q&A box. So please, if you have any questions, you can add them in here. There are already some questions and comments in the Q&A box. So maybe we could start with those. You can stop sharing your screen if that before we take the questions. Yeah. Okay. Hi. Good to have you back. So there are a couple of questions. So let me just sort of questions and comments. The first question that came up in this context, let me sort of read it out to you. It's from Mustaq. Is, can suicide be prevented? And can people be trained or educated, and who is accountable? And can these large structural organizations that you spoke about, right, governments, corporations, can they be made aware and sort of maybe held responsible for these deaths? I mean, there's a fair bit to unpack there.
Yeah, do you want me to have a go at that now? Thank you so much, Mustaq, for this brilliant questions, more than one question. I think that's such a good question that you start with there. Can suicide be prevented? And within some of the discussions that I have been lucky enough to be part of with the Critical Suicide Studies Network folks, this is something that comes up a lot, and I think people really differ on, so worth me saying this is from my perspective. I think, again, this depends on framing, right? It depends how we understand suicide more broadly. And understanding the different contextual factors of different kinds of suicide, I suppose. So I think one of the ways of answering that is, I think the conditions that incite suicidality, that make life unlivable, can be prevented. But those conditions would, in changing those conditions, involve something absolutely huge that I think is beyond kind of small reforms and tweaks in the system. That's my opinion. So I suppose I'm taking in its joyous creative form a much more abolitionist understanding here. I think we need to, completely rethink some of those systems that we're living in and that make a lot of people's lives unlivable. And because our lives are so interconnected and interdependent, that would mean changing everybody's lives. And it would make life, in my opinion, more livable for everybody, because even those who live the kind of the privilege of the economic system that we live in, they're missing out on so many things as well, right? So I think it would make life more livable for everyone. But I think it can be prevented in that sense. But I think we should be focusing on the conditions that make people feel, and actually not just make people feel, but actually tell people their lives aren't worth living. Because I think that's what's happening in UK. In the UK, the government and the media have explicitly dehumanized disabled people. Disabled people are often talked about as a burden, as a cost to the state, as lazy. So when disabled people say they feel like a burden and that might result in feelings of suicidality, that's because they're being told that. This isn't just about a kind of misperception. I think it's explicitly about the way of those sorts of framings from government. So yes, I think it can be prevented, but I think we should be focusing on those bigger structural systemic issues, not necessarily focusing on suicide itself. And I think the question about, how much evidence do we gather if we think the government, do we think the governments and corporations are going to make these changes with the right amount of evidence, or are their demands for evidence in ever greater, more detail and more finely tuned, just ways of delaying them taking responsibility and accountability? I'll stop there in case you want to come back.
Okay, thank you, Chanu. I'll go to the next question, which is from Gaurav, and he thanks you for an excellent talk. And the question is, how would you situate narratives of recovery versus that of suicide within the context of social justice?
Thank you. So I'm thinking, maybe is this around mental health recovery? Or I'm not entirely certain of this question.
Gaurav, if you'd like to maybe clarify or add in more detail, you could share it with us.
Yes, mental health. Okay, I can see that they have. Thank you. This is really interesting. I think so. Let me just contextualize this from where I'm coming from, because depending on where you're all coming from, recovery might mean something quite different. So the idea of recovery is massively important, okay, within mental health. But what's happened, in my understanding in the UK, is that idea has been largely co-opted in a way whereby people are made responsible for their own recovery. So there isn't, again, a bit like thinking about mental health more broadly or suicide, there's no wider collective or societal structural responsibility for creating the conditions that might either allow a person to just live the life that they want to and that they value, their own dignified life. Instead, recovery has sort of been, has come to mean particular things, which is nearly always in the UK associated with paid work. Because we have such a strong narrative of like, if you're not in paid work, then you're not worthy, essentially. That's how people's value is calculated. And so much of this narrative around suicide is also linked to that. So for example, in the UK, we have a wonderful, I don't know how they would describe themselves, activist group or organising campaign and group called Recovery in the Bin, which is a way of thinking about throwing out this co-opted version of recovery that we currently have. So I think there are loads of similarities in those narratives. The problem is that the version of recovery we have in the UK is often this kind of looking back at your previous self who was experiencing distress from somehow a kind of privileged retrospective position where you've now got paid work and you're living a life that you're told you should value. And I don't believe, and neither do lots of people, that that's the only way of understanding recovery. And also, recovery doesn't have to be this linear thing, right, where we kind of look back on something and we've sort of got there. It may be that we live with some of the things that we experience, like a lot of folks who hear voices, for example, may not want to recover as such, but they may want to live with those experiences, but in a way in which they consent and they have power to do that. So I think it really depends on the kind of recovery we're talking about, I suppose. But thank you for that question.
Thank you, China. There are a bunch of questions, so I'm going to kind of skip ahead to try to give everyone's question some time. There's an interesting question from Mashal. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She thanks you for your talk, and she wanted to ask you what you think about the role that mental health services play when they're entrusted with caring for someone who has borne the brunt of the upstream factors you spoke of, and now presents in a time of acute crisis after a long period of the slow violence you mentioned. Do treatments that make life survivable, that is antidepressants, therapy, are they ethical or do they mask oppression and have long-term harm?
Yeah, thank you, Mashal. I think that's such an important question that we could talk about all day, right? I think it's also not, all I could give is my perspective. It's not for me to speak from any other positionality that I don't occupy. And so I know people for a fact that some people would say that, having those treatments does allow them to survive in the short term. And so we shouldn't dismiss those kinds of services or treatments in any way. And I think we have to honour that. But there is a way of doing both and in some ways. And I think the problem is, I suppose, that in the UK, the very same thing that has been part of welfare reform and austerity has also been cuts to services. So actually, even people who describe themselves as experiencing like acute crisis struggle to find anywhere that they can go or any help that they can get. They'll be put on extremely long waiting lists. So there's actually very, very few people that even experience being taken into a kind of mental health facility. And for some of those people, depending on what those services are like, that can be a really violent, dehumanizing experience. And for other people, it might be life-saving. And we do have in the UK more kind of user-run crisis services, which I think can be very different because they're informed by lived experience. But I think we absolutely need to, all of what we're doing should be about transforming these more widespread systems. And we know the harms of these kinds of services and treatments that are part of the medical industrial complex. And so we need to be thinking about life being survivable in the short term, yes, and doing this bigger work, attending to these bigger systems and structures which are making people's lives so unlivable and so difficult.
There are some excellent questions still in the chat, though we are kind of reaching our time limit. I will, of course, take another couple of questions, but I'd also like to tell our participants that there is a tutorial session with China in half an hour, where you'll be able to sort of interact in person with her. So there, the team will share the link with you, so you can join us in half an hour to continue the discussion in person with China. This is at 8 p.m. So you can join us at that link. And maybe we'll just take one last question, China, which came in. It's a question. It asks, for LGBTQ plus populations, particularly in India, do you think societal or policy changes will have a larger impact in reducing suicide deaths than simple therapy interventions?
Thank you. That I don't want to speak out of my expertise on that, and so I honestly don't know. But I would imagine that nearly in all contexts, that some of those, you know, those bigger societal systemic changes obviously make, but depending on what they are, can make a big difference to a large number of people. Though that doesn't mean that forms of kind of therapy or collective work in that way isn't important, because of course it might be. But yeah, this speaks out of my expertise, so I wouldn't want to say anything about this. Though it's worth me saying that Jasbir Puar, who is an academic in the States, has done some writing around queer youth suicide, I think in the States. And she also writes about conditions of debility and lethal conditions, and you know, the very conditions that make lives unlivable. But she talks about that in relation to the suicides of queer young people. So that might be worth having a look at that work if that's of interest.
Okay. I think in the interest of time, we will wrap up the session here. But again, I'd just like to say, I know there are many more questions, and I'm very sorry that we could not take them right now, but do join China in 30 minutes for the tutorial session, and you'll be able to interact with her and ask your questions in further detail. Again, thank you so much, China, for this session. I'd also like to remind the audience, if you if you think there's someone you'd like for them to listen to this lecture, or if you'd like to rewatch the talk again, the recording of the lecture will be available on our YouTube channel. So please subscribe to it, and you can also watch our previous events. A relevant event, if you want to know more about this, especially in the Indian context, would be to watch a lecture by Dr. Soumitra Pathare. His lecture was titled "A Silent Crisis: Suicides Amongst Young People in India," where he speaks about some of the most, especially during the pandemic, what has happened to this situation. So it, that might be a really interesting piece for you to have a listen to. And you could also consider signing up for a lecture titled "Reimagining the Path to Recovery" by psychiatrist Vikram Patel, which is happening next Sunday, and that is the last event at Psyche. And Vikram will be talking about how we need to empower the community to reimagine mental health care systems in India. So again, that might be really, it might be a good follow-on from this session today. You can also check out the exhibit Black Men's Minds by artist Stephen Rudder, which is there in Psyche. It's another interesting piece that captures the voices and experiences of those in marginalized communities who are vulnerable, who have been sectioned under the Mental Health Act in the UK. So again, this might be an interesting piece to see after today's talk. I'd also like to remind the audience to share their feedback. The link to the feedback form is in the chat. So please do give us your thoughts about today's session, as well as what kind of programming Science Gallery could do going forward. Once again, thank you so much, China, for taking the time out to be with us here today and talk to us about this issue. And I look forward to seeing you all again in future programs. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.